Hi, everyone.
Hi, we hear you. So good to have you here. So let me introduce you. Amanda's just so wonderful. I'm very honored to have you here today. Uh, Dr. Rodewald is the Garvin Professor and Senior Director of the Center for Avian Population Studies, or what we call CAPS, at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. She also has appointments in Cornell's Department of Natural Resources and the Environment and the Cornell Atkinson Center for Sustainability. She leads a multidisciplinary research program that integrates conservation biology, ecology, participatory science, and social science to address conservation challenges in working landscapes. She collaborates with a wide range of conservation practitioners, decision makers, and leaders at government agencies, NGOs, and in the private sector to develop practical approaches to conservation that can accommodate societal and ecological needs. In addition, she has published over 185 scientific papers, an ornithology textbook, 10 book chapters, and over 70 popular articles and commentaries. And you may have heard Amanda's voice or read her work on the radio or in film, podcasts, or news articles. So few people are as prepared to talk about bird conservation, the challenges we have, and the ways that we can approach it strategically. So thank you, Amanda, for being with us today.
Oh, well, thanks so much for the invitation to visit with you all. And I'm just thrilled to be here. This Birds of the World community is such a vibrant one at the lab. And so we're honored that you all would make the time or take the time out of your schedule to join us. So thank you. So I will go ahead and start sharing here a couple things. So,
Sure.
all right. All right. So, yeah, thanks again, everyone. And so, what I'm going to do today is give you just a tour through some of the ways that we're using eBird data. So, the data that is really the result of so many participants, 1 million eBirders around the world, probably many of you, and how we're able to take that information and to use it in a way that helps to protect the environment, to protect birds, and also really to make the world a better place for people as well. So I'm really happy to be here with you. So although that initial intro is super enthusiastic and optimistic, we're going to start on really a more sober note. And that is just the larger context of the work we're trying to do in the world today. And you've probably have seen headlines that are similar to this, right? That are sounding the alarm for alarming declines we've seen in bird populations around the world. So globally, about half of the bird species have populations that are declining. And in North America alone, we know we've lost over about 3 billion birds since 1970. That's since my lifetime alone. And that represents almost 1 in 3 individual birds from breeding populations have been lost. So one of the alarming aspects of some of the declines that we've been seeing, and particularly in North America, if we look where we have, really good data, is that we see declines in bird populations that are occurring across every habitat group, really. There are some exceptions with some water birds and waterfowl that we've been specifically managing for. Those are real conservation successes. But you can see here that we're getting a signal that no matter what kind of ecosystems or biomes we might choose to focus on, birds are having trouble really thriving as they once did. And so that's a problem, not only for those of us who love birds, right? Birds are important to us, in their own right. But we also know in the broader context, even for individuals who may not be particularly, tuned in to care about birds specifically, it's relevant because birds can provide important ecosystem services that also benefit us and the planet. Right? We can think about, seed dispersal, controlling insects, scavengers. All of these are roles that really help to support healthy environments that we all depend upon. And so for that reason, bird conservation isn't something that we need to do just for the sake of birds, right? It's something that we need to do for our own benefit and to benefit the planet, and really to achieve the sustainable development goals that have been outlined by the UN. And so, again, that's really, I think, an important context for the kind of conservation we're trying to do with eBird. Yes, we're trying to support birds and improve and recover their populations, but we're also thinking much more broadly about how can eBird data be used in ways that really make this a better planet for everyone and all species that are living on it. And what's interesting, I want to just take a moment to say that although, some people might think, well, business or, private sector partners might be less keen on playing that positive role or using our data in order to support their decision making, that's not, in fact, what we see in many cases. And so you might be surprised to know that there were, a few years ago, there was a survey done of CEOs in companies around the world. And they recognize that, environmental changes, climate change, extreme weather, and even biodiversity loss are extremely important to their own operations and their own success. And if we look broadly, about half of the world's GDP depends moderately or highly on nature and its services. So again, we really think that a lot of the conservation work that benefits birds is also really supporting these other very, kind of foundational components of our global economy and the resources we need to survive. So looking ahead at conservation in the future, what does that look like? Do we just need to do more conservation? I think oftentimes that's what we think. It's like we just need more. And that is one part of it. But it's really a bit more nuanced than that. Because if we think about all of the different demands there are for land, for resources, and these competing kind of global challenges that are urgent and we need to address, what we need to do is actually have smarter conservation. And by that, I mean conservation that's really strategic. So we know we're getting good returns on those conservation investments, and they're directed to the places that are most urgently require some sort of an intervention. We also know that we need conservation to be more precise. And by that, I mean that we need to be sure that we're acting at the right places and the right times. And we need to do that because we need to accommodate other human activities out there. And then finally, we need some flexibility with conservation. And that's where information allows us to really be able to maybe shift the places we focus or the timing of different conservation efforts in order to accommodate other needs. And so again, what I'm talking about is not just doing more out there, but finding ways to have the right interventions or actions at the right places and at the right time. And that sounds great, right? Like all good ideas, perfect, sounds super, it's simple to say, but the reality is it requires a lot of information, right? And this is where birds can help us. Right? And so birds have, especially at the Cornell lab, we're now able to collect and use information on birds through citizen science programs like eBird or other sort of using other technologies like radar or bioacoustics and leveraging new advancements in computing, and then working with partners and people who care around the world. This is where we're trying to bring the information we have about birds, thanks to you and our global community of eBirders, out there and bring that science and information to action. So what I'll be focusing on today is really what we kind of think of as a global network of biodiversity sensors in people like you who are out there birding. And you might be birding for fun, that's the main driver, or because you really want to contribute to conservation, or you're interested, in science and improving our knowledge there, whatever the reason, you really are out there acting as this sensor who's collecting useful information that really no one else is able to provide to us. And eBird is the main platform that I'll be focusing on. So again, eBird is a participatory science project. And here you're looking at a heat map of where we've of eBird checklists. And so the brighter the color shows you where we have a greater number of checklists. And globally, we've had just phenomenal growth thanks to the different partnerships around the world. We now have about 1 million eBirders and almost 2 billion observations that have been submitted. And this is fortunate because, we're facing a lot of problems in the world, and we know big problems, well, need big data like this eBird that we're working on. And so we talk about at the Lab of Ornithology this framework that we call eBird Science to Action. And by that, we're just talking about kind of this pipeline where we're able to have new technology that allows us to engage with participants around the world in order to have them record observations, submit them to us, advancements in, cloud computing resources, and collections allow us to archive those data. That technology allows us to connect with people around the world in order to get them excited and interested in getting out there to submit eBird observations. And then we can turn that into actionable science by working with scientists, computer scientists, and data scientists in order to analyze those data. And I'll be talking a little bit more about that. Those resources are then used by a wide variety of partners or key actors, as we'd call them out there. So whether it's individuals or community groups, NGOs like conservation organizations like Wildlife Conservation Society, agencies, federal, state, international agencies, you name it, can use that information to actually help support the decisions that they're making. So one place I really want to start out first is what I mean when I'm talking about eBird data and the kinds of data products that we're using in the applications I'm going to share with you today. So eBird data, the way it is submitted to the platform is, what we would call our raw data, right? It's just what we collect information, through our apps, or online, through web interfaces, you can submit information. And so here you can see here in these little screenshots how people can use, start a checklist and submit the observations, the numbers of different species that they're seeing. And I want to just pause a second and just distinguish between what's an eBird observation and an eBird checklist, because there's an important distinction that has consequences for how that information is used downstream by us. So an observation, it can be just a one-off, I'm walking through the forest and I just, I saw a wood thrush in the tree and I go and I report it and submit it. And that would be just a single observation. Or maybe I'm on a walk and I just happen to make a note of, 10 species that I saw flocking together. I submit that. A checklist is different because a checklist includes all of the species that you're seeing or hearing. And by including and specifying that, yes, I've submitted all the species that I've seen or heard during this session, whether walking or at a point during this observation or checklist, that allows us to know not only what's there, but also what's not there. And that absence data is just as important as knowing what's there for our work. And so what we do at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology in our what we call our eBird status and trends projects is we take eBird checklists, we combine them with remotely sensed information on environmental factors, environmental variables out there that we also know affect birds, and with information on eBird participants. So, how, if they were birding alone or with others, how far they traveled, how long they traveled, the time of day, all of the kinds of information that can affect your ability to detect species. That information is also baked into our analysis. And so we use a very sophisticated statistical process of, filtering the data, for high quality observations. We subsample across space in order to eliminate some of the spatial bias we see. We use what we call a checklist calibration index, which is a way that we can statistically account for differences in skill levels among observers based on either how long they've been birding or maybe where they're birding. And then we use that information within a very innovative machine learning framework to produce estimates of abundance and population trend. And then those are extensively validated. So we have a lot of confidence in how rigorous these data products are. And that's what we call eBird status and trends. So if you've been to the web page, you're probably familiar with this, this interface. And so eBird status and trends has sort of two things, I would say, that we bring to the broader community that are helpful in conservation. So one is on the methodological side. So those methods that I just overviewed in such a coarse way, it doesn't do any justice to the amount of work that's gone into really developing them. But those methods are used by people even outside of the lab. So that those methodological innovations are shared with the broader community so that other people can also use those data products in similar ways, whether for science or decision making. And then we also have a lot of products that we share. Those include range maps. We can have information on the occurrence, the likelihood of occurrence for species, their relative abundance and habitat associations, and more recently, population trends. And then those products are really what we are using in a variety of contexts through different visualizations, science products, and on-the-ground conservation applications. So again, today I'm going to be going through some of these examples with you here. But I just want to first give you a sort of example of some of these products. So here you're looking at a relative abundance map for the barn swallow. And you can see that there are different colors that denote the season of occurrence. So in the red shows where the bird is breeding, in the purple is where it's resident year round. And you can see how there are estimates of relative abundance for different stages in the life cycle. We can also look at these sorts of animations, right, where we're actually looking at weekly abundance of barn swallows over the course of a year, as you can see here. And so the darker purple tells you where that species is more abundant in a given week. And so this is a way that we're able to really get a better sense of where the bird occurs globally throughout their full annual cycle, and also the timing of different events like migration. And here we're looking at one of our recent products, the trends, eBird trends. And so we've been able to provide the finest scale estimates of population trends that are available now for birds, mostly in North America, we're looking. And so here the size of the dot indicates how many relative birds are there. The bigger the dot, the more abundant barn swallows are in that location. And the darker the red, the more steeply declining they are. And if they're blue, that would also indicate how much they're increasing. And this figure can give you a sense of just how transformative it is to have these finer spatial scale estimates of population trend. So if we look at these two species just as examples, wood duck and great blue heron. On the left, you can see if we were to take eBird data and just across the whole range of the species, come up with a single estimate of population trend For wood duck, it would be positive. For great heron, negative, right? If we look at regions, and here we're looking at bird conservation regions, so you can see just with the color, the different size and configuration of those different polygons. And you can see we start detecting, okay, well, maybe those population trends aren't as simple as what we see in the range-wide ones. We actually find for wood duck, okay, well, sure, they're increasing in the Midwest and upper Midwest, but they're decreasing in the Southeast, right? And for great blue heron, we actually see, well, in the Rockies, Intermountain Rockies, we're seeing some population increases that we couldn't detect at range scale. And then if we look at the landscape scale, and that's where eBird trends are, this is 27 by 27 kilometers squared. We even see a finer level of detail, right? And so like if we look here for great blue heron, the bottom right, you can see suddenly the Appalachian Mountains, show up as an area where we're actually getting population increases, right? And so you can imagine that when we have this sort of fine information on population trends, that gives us so much more ability to be proactive in our conservation. We can get those first signals of declines and really step in to try to address them. We can better try to understand what some of the causes of declines might be, because we can look at how those trends relate to variation in environmental factors or other human activities that might be driving that. And we can do that not only for individual species, but also for groups of species. So here we're looking at wetland and water species, like water birds, just as a whole. And we can look either on the left at the severity of trends. So what pops out to me there is if you look at like the Mississippi alluvial valley, we're getting some really steep declines in some of these wetland and water birds. And on the right, we're looking at the percentage of species that are in a state of decline. So again, we see in that same area, most of the species are actually declining. Oops, sorry. Okay, so now we're going to jump into some of these examples. So the first suite of examples that I want to share are how we can use eBird data products in order to help identify spatial priorities. It's kind of where should we focus our efforts, and to track management outcomes. And so first I'll use an example in the US looking at some of our federal public lands. So across the continental US, 4 agencies are managing over a quarter of the US land area. The Bureau of Land Management, US Forest Service, National Park Service, and the US Fish and Wildlife Service. And as you might imagine, these agencies have a lot of management imperatives, right? They need to juggle multiple uses. Bird conservation is but one of many mandates they have on those lands. So it's useful for them to have a better sense of, okay, what are the species that we have the most responsibility for, and where should we be focusing our efforts to conserve them? And we can do that now with eBird data. Right, so here I'm just showing you some examples of different species that are highly reliant on land managed by one of those big 4 agencies. And so here you could see the top one, white-headed woodpecker. 95% of its population or maximum abundance in the US is occurring on land managed by one of those 4 agencies at some point in the year. Dusky and sooty grouses, in the 90% as well. Clark's nutcracker, same. American dipper, 91%. So you can see just, again, this information really helps agencies to identify, okay, if we're not taking action for these species for which we have high responsibility, then we're really setting ourselves up for a potentially dangerous situation where they experience declines that are really difficult for us to recover from. And we can quantify this for entire groups of birds. So arid lands, or more those really dry lands in the like in the Great Basins of the Western US. You know, we can not only identify, all right, which arid land species are more important, but we can actually estimate what percentage of all of the birds using arid lands are highly dependent on land across the agencies. So here what we see right here on the bottom for the Bureau of Land Management, over half of arid land species have at least a quarter of their population on land managed by BLM alone. So that's really, again, useful as they're identifying their own management objectives. But we can go farther and not just identify species, but really start helping these agencies know, okay, where do we need to focus? So for arid lands, here on the left, you can see this darker color. This is showing, the darker the color shows you how much more important an area is for arid land birds relative to the lighter colors. So all of the land, every place that's colored on this map shows you BLM land, Bureau of Land Management land holdings. And you can see that there are the most arid land birds right here in the desert Southwest. Not that surprising. But that in and of itself, just knowing where birds are most abundant, that's one piece of important information, but it's not sufficient to really help prioritize actions alone. We also want to know, okay, how are those populations doing? And that's where eBird trend data now allows us to look separately and say, okay, well, where are we seeing the greatest percentage of arid land species in the state of decline? That's in the top right map. And you see it's actually in a different area. Well, there we're looking at eastern Montana, right? That's where, and northeast Wyoming is where we actually see some of the greatest proportions of arid land birds declining. And on this lower right map, you're looking at the severity of the trend. And so the darker red color shows you where those populations are declining more severely. And we see, again, that's in the eastern Montana. So this is a way that we've been providing information to federal agencies to help them to prioritize and be strategic with their investments. We're doing this for state agencies as well. We've recently launched a different portal where we've summarized in a very user-friendly way, which is like Excel spreadsheets and visualizations like maps and PDFs, where they can then look for their state. What are the species for which they have the greatest responsibility? Where are some of the locations that are going to be most important? We're doing this same thing with land trusts now too, where we're linking them with eBird data and trying to really, I guess, innovate new ways that they can use eBird in order to be more strategic with the actions that they're taking within land trusts. So like, where are they trying to acquire lands? And also with the monitoring. And so as part of our land trust bird conservation initiative, we have a kind of story map where land trusts can share different ways that they're using eBird data to meet their own conservation objectives. And then finally, on the private sector part, we're finding that there's growing interest among many businesses and industries in order to know how they can track and monitor how their own operations are affecting biodiversity, and in order to make sure that their efforts to be more sustainable are actually having the outcomes that they intend. And this is important in some cases, just, maybe their products depend on having really healthy environments, like with coffee or certain kinds of agriculture. Other times it might be driven by an interest in assuring their customers, their board members, or other lending organizations or regulatory organizations that they're not actually having negative outcomes or impacts on biodiversity. So one example of how we're doing this is we've been working with different actors in the coffee industry to develop a biodiversity progress index. Again, allows them to track over time how their lands that they're managing or their practices are affecting biodiversity and how that fits into the larger regional efforts to conserve species as well. So the next few examples that I want to share are focused specifically on migratory birds. So as you can imagine, and probably thinking back about our, some of these images that we have or animations of weekly trends, right? You can just imagine that prior to having eBird data, such a global extent of information on where birds go, it was really difficult to know where many migratory species were in the other season. So if you were in Colombia, you might see Swainson's thrush, but it's hard to really know, well, where are they going in other parts of the year, in North America, vice versa, right? And so suddenly eBird is giving us, because we have weekly estimates of abundance, we now have much more information than ever before on the places that these species are using around their full annual cycle. So whether they're breeding or non-breeding or migrating in between the two areas. And this is really important. Again, there's sort of broad context here because we know that for migratory species and not only birds, about half are in a state of decline globally, and 1 in 5 migratory species are threatened with extinction. So this is a really serious issue. And this report that came out last February, I think, highlighted the fact that we don't have a lot of information on all of the places around the year that are important to migratory animals. Fortunately, with birds, we do have more information now because of eBird. And so these are some maps that can just give you a sense of how we can take all of that information, bring it together in order to identify across entire hemispheres, where are the most important places for different groups of birds. So on the left, this map with the blue colors, there you're looking at some of the priority locations for 41 species of shorebirds. The darker the color indicates how much the importance of it. So the darker, the more important it is for those birds. In the middle, we're looking at priority stopover sites. This is where birds, as they're migrating, are going to stop over to rest and refuel. So those stopover locations have been historically really difficult to identify in a comprehensive way. We now have a lens through which we can do this with eBird data. So we can look at fall migration sites that are important, spring migration sites, ones that are important both times during the year, and how those overlap with protected areas. And what you see in that middle map is, wow, most stopover areas are not protected at all. On the right, we're seeing, again, a hemispheric map that shows the priority locations for 117 species of songbirds across the full annual cycle. So these are the sites that we show are necessary to protect at least a third of the populations of these 117 species. So again, this information can help to coordinate cross-border conservation efforts. It can be used to help justify why certain land has to be protected or acquired, or different management should or should not occur in these places. So it's used in a variety of ways. And again, it's made possible because of eBird. Another really cool way that those kinds of maps are used is in combination with other information that allows us to sort of say get a bigger bang for our buck, right? To get more benefit. And sometimes we talk about co-benefits in conservation. And by this we mean that, maybe we care most about protecting some of these migratory shorebirds. Okay, that's the central goal of some conservation effort we have underway. But we want to do that in a way where maybe we can also derive some benefits for air quality, or for pollinators like wild bees, or do it in a way where we're not only protecting important sites for shorebirds, but also shorebirds and where we need, there's a lot of soil organic carbon, to help with, climate mitigation. Or maybe we want to do this in a way we want to select sites that are important for shorebirds, but also don't have a lot of opportunity costs because they're really suitable for other forms of development that are important for humans from a social perspective. Or we're looking for the cost to get the best land for the least cost. So all of the information in these maps that I show you can be, and in fact are, being combined with different types of information. So the decision isn't just being made, with kind of blinders on thinking about birds. It can be made in a way that is thinking simultaneously about the many challenges we're facing and how to make choices that really help overall. We also have the ability now to identify connections, like what we call stewardship connections. And this can help let agencies especially know that, okay, we have to do more than just invest here, in New York, if we care about New York birds, because in the non-breeding season, New York birds are actually traveling to these other locations over the course of the year. So you can look at the dark color. The darker the color shows you where a lot of these 62 breeding species in New York are spending time outside of the breeding season. In Missouri, a lot of these 17 species of concern in Missouri, you can see the colors show you where they're spending the winter, right? And so that is also, again, useful information. So Missouri, Department of Conservation knows that if they want to protect their breeding, there's those species of concern, they need to make sure they're not only providing habitat in Missouri, but also making sure that they're doing their part to support conservation that's happening in these other regions. And so the last couple examples I want to share with you is how we're using this information to really help with precision conservation. And it might be precision related to just very specific areas, like what places, or also precision in terms of time, right? And here, this example, just kind of harkens to the issue we have with grassland birds and mowing hayfields. That's a time issue, right? Yeah, we can have hayfields. A lot of grassland birds do fine in hayfields, except when you mow them. Well, can we use our information to identify the times to avoid? So just again, a quick kind of sample of some of the ways we're using this. So one is to identify places where we might expect there to be more conflict with human activities. So we can use this one example with mining concessions. So over the last several years, we've seen the number of concessions for mines just really boom in the northern Andes of South America. And so this is concerning from a number of perspectives, including birds. Well, what we can do is we can take eBird data, we can combine it with the information on where these mining concessions have been granted. And sorry, a concession means that it's been a permit, has been granted for a mine, but not necessarily, it hasn't actually happened yet. So there's still time to adjust. And so we can combine those in ways, if you look at this large map on the right, you can see we've overlaid them, and the red areas indicate where you have a mining concession that's in a high priority area for long distance migratory birds, right? And again, just as an example. And so that could tell NGOs or governments that, okay, there are higher biodiversity costs if we mine in this location, as opposed to one of the black areas that shows a concession that is not in a high priority area. So it helps to guide decision-making to reduce impacts. We can use the information in a way to be alerted where we might start seeing problems that could threaten birds in the future. We had a recent paper looking at narco trafficking, which results in a lot of deforestation they're building landing strips and roads to get the product out. And by working with social scientists and combining that information with eBird data, we can actually identify the areas that are important for our migratory birds that are, based on a lot of the social science information we have, are likely to become threatened or targets for narco trafficking. So again, it allows us to be proactive as well. And we can even use eBird data in a regulatory context to help us be more effective at permitting for renewable energy development like wind. So in this case, we've been working with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to really help them to streamline their permitting process and improve its ability to kind of identify when there are problems or where there won't be problems for permitting by identifying where wind facilities would be most likely to kill, or harm eagles, which are protected under federal law. And so what that does is it actually allows the Fish and Wildlife Service, who's overrun with a lot of these permits, to focus their most careful attention on those permits that are going to be in areas where you're likely to have more risk, and really help to not unnecessarily bog down permits that are happening in areas that have really low risk. So it kind of is a way of accommodating some genuine needs we have to expand renewable energy with the simultaneous need we have to be really thoughtful and careful about how we site those activities. And I think it's interesting. A lot of people, I think, initially might think, well, if you have more information about where birds or other species are, that's just going to restrict human activity even more, right? It turns out that actually isn't the case. So right now, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has been mandated to identify areas that eagles are using and to sometimes restrict activities in those areas. They've been using aerial surveys historically to monitor golden eagle populations in this example. And so you can see on the left a map that shows the predicted density of golden eagles in the Western US based on their aerial surveys. And so you'll notice there are really large areas, right, that are estimated to have pretty high densities. So if you just have that information, again, pretty big areas are identified, high risk. If we combine eBird data with those aerial surveys, instead what you get are maps like on the right. And you can see it is much more fine-grained. And it has a much smaller footprint of areas that are identified as potentially having larger numbers of golden eagles that we need to be extra careful about human activities that could impact them. So again, being precise actually helps us to accommodate activity. And so for this reason, and to help improve their efforts, the Fish and Wildlife Service has recently officially adopted eBird data as one of their information sources that they're using. And so there I was looking at really fine spatial scale as being a sort of transformative element of what eBird data can provide. Well, that also can happen in terms of time. I talked like with the example of grassland birds and mowing, right? Sometimes we just need an intervention or we need actions that happen at one point in time. And so an example of this is in the Central Valley of California, where you have a lot of agriculture, including rice fields that you see here. Well, the conflict is that you have rice fields, super important for agriculture. It's also really important for migrating shorebirds and water birds every year. Now that sounds like a win-win inherently, but it turns out the timing isn't exactly aligned for what you would want to do to, optimally farm rice versus when birds are moving through the area. So here, this line shows you the abundance or the probability of water birds being in an area. So you can see that is highest in the non-breeding season. Now, with rice farming, fields are normally flooded in the winter but darn, just as these birds are still there, they haven't left yet, they're still trying to feed and rest and refuel, that's when they start drawing down the water on these farms. And so the issue in California that they were trying to deal with is they want to have more water out there on the landscape, but the land's just too darn expensive to buy. And of course, people have livelihoods they don't want to give up. So what we can do with eBird data is we can make predictions about where those birds are, where they're going to be in a given year. Using hydrological data or water models, we can identify where we'd expect there to be water already, and we can estimate where the most important fields are for birds, right? And with that information all together, this project, and so it was with TN, the Nature Conservancy, had a program where they asked farmers then, okay, give us a bid. Tell us what we need to pay you in order for you to keep your fields flooded for an extra 6 weeks during the winter. A farmer can say, okay, this is what it costs me, submit the bid. But then the Nature Conservancy biologists could then rank those bids based on sort of the cost that a farmer was requesting and the conservation value of that field. And that allowed them to allocate money in the most strategic way. And it turns out, it cost just a fraction of what it would cost to buy and restore the land and take it completely out of circulation. And so, and we can do these sorts of things, whether it's in the Central Valley, we can do this in the Sagebrush Sea to really try to identify where we can focus for restoration efforts as well. We can look at our trends for sage thrasher, which you see on the left. Again, the red shows you where the populations are declining. The bigger the circle, the more abundant the birds are. We can do research that lets us identify, all right, what are the habitat features that are driving or most associated with those population changes? And then look at how those relationships play out over space, right? So here it's like, okay, those purple dots show you where like dense herbaceous vegetation, which a lot of invasive exotic species, and where is that actually causing birds to decline? Versus green, where the whatever's there locally is actually helping them. And then we can start modeling, all right, for different restoration scenarios, what is the effect of those management treatments? And so, for example, if we were going to go out and implement a restoration that reduced some of that exotic herbaceous vegetation and increased some of the sparse native forests, the darker the color of those circles shows us where we're going to get the strongest positive population response for our sage thrasher. So if we need to make choices about where to work, here we have evidence that can help us make those decisions. And if we want to manage for sage thrasher and sagebrush sparrow, we can actually look at their map too and find circles where we're finding positive responses that align with them. So, with that, again, I think that these are just some really high level, quick examples of how eBird science is helping conservation be more strategic and effective, helps us be more precise, yet flexible and accommodating. And it all starts with you. And your broader circle of eBirders and people who love birds and who love nature and who want to get out there and help to collect information that support these efforts. And so working together, we're really just honored and excited by the generosity of eBird participants, giving their time, their information, that allow us to better protect what we have in terms of nature and birds that are out there, and to restore some of what we've lost, to make good decisions about that, and really to transform how we lead our lives. And so, with that, again, it's a high level, quick paced overview. But I just want to end mostly by just thanking again you for your time and being here, but especially for this global community of eBirders who make this work possible, because really it is a community effort. And it's such an honor for all of us at the Cornell lab to be a part of that.